Well, hello. My name is Irene Moore Davis. I am president of the Essex County Black Historical Research Society, and I'm going to be talking today about a concise history of the transatlantic slave trade and how it is that African peoples have been dispersed throughout the Western Hemisphere prior to the period of voluntary immigration. So, before I talk about the transatlantic slave trade briefly, I do want to mention that there has been evidence, as explored by historians such as Ivan van Sertima and Lerone Bennett, of pre-Columbian African exploration of the New World. And that's a very interesting area of inquiry and something that I would recommend you read up on if you're interested in learning more about that. Consider some books by Van Sertima and Bennett, such as They Came Before Columbus and the great canon of works that Ivan van Sertima presented during his lifetime. And that's something very interesting that you might want to investigate if you'd like to know more about that. In addition, there were, prior to the enslavement of people of African descent on a widespread basis, some individuals who were free persons of African descent who came to the New World. For example, here in Canada, we know the story of Matthew da Costa, who was a Portuguese-born but African-descended navigator who sailed to what is now Atlantic Canada with explorers of European backgrounds, and was involved not only as a ship navigator but as a translator, speaking or trying to speak with the indigenous populations that they encountered. So that is the first known person of African descent ever to arrive in Canada, and he was not an enslaved person. But the vast majority of individuals from the continent of Africa who came to the New World in the pre-modern era were enslaved individuals. And that is due to the agony and the travesty and the genocide that was the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade lasted about 370 years. Some say it lasted almost 400 years. And it resulted in millions of Black men, women, and children being removed from their homelands and from everything they had ever known and being brought to destinations such as South America, Central America, the Caribbean, the United States, and yes, even Canada. And they often lived their entire lives in a system of chattel slavery. To support, legitimize, and sustain the slave trade, anti-Black ideology and laws were developed, ensuring that, for example, individuals born to enslaved parents would always remain in slavery themselves. And indeed, a whole system of racist ideology was developed to justify the ongoing enslavement and dehumanization of African peoples. Those are ideologies that persist even to the present day, and we see the vestiges of those ideologies in terms of the anti-Black racism that persists. The regular suggestion that we are more villainous, more likely to engage in criminal activity, that we are less safe to be around, that we don't belong in nice neighborhoods, that we don't have the intelligence to progress into certain professions or skilled trades or other occupations, that we don't have the intelligence or the calm and reasoning skills to be trusted in society. These things, as you can imagine, have no basis in fact, but they are part of a racist ideology that really began with the system of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery, and that continue to have impacts on Blacks as we interact with the education systems, the financial systems, housing and services, and certainly the criminal justice system and child welfare or child protective services systems. So those things continue to have an impact today. So the transatlantic slave trade, as I mentioned, lasted almost 4 centuries. And in some jurisdictions, there were laws that were established to ensure that enslaved people would remain in slavery and to restrict the mobility of other people of African descent. We consider, for example, laws against allowing enslaved people to be educated or to gain literacy in many parts of the American South. Or there were other laws that insisted that should a person of African descent be granted his or her freedom, or what we call either manumitted or emancipated, that individual must leave the state rather than remaining in proximity to their friends and family still living in slavery and potentially having an influence on them and making them want to be free. So for generations, this made the enslavement of many people of African descent in the New World very different from previous forms of slavery that had existed, such as indentured servitude. Indentured servitude was a form of slavery, but it was a time-bound, a finite form of slavery, and you could eventually be freed from it if you served your designated time. So the transatlantic slave trade is often regarded as the first system of globalization, and the French historian Jean-Michel Deveau has written that the slave trade and slavery constitute one of the greatest tragedies in the history of humanity in terms of both scale and duration. The transatlantic slave trade was the biggest deportation in history, and it connected the economies of Europe, Africa, and the entire New World. The transatlantic slave trade saw about 13 to 15 million Africans taken captive and brought forcibly to the Western Hemisphere. And it's estimated that only 11 million of them made it. Many died on the way, through drowning, through disease, as a result of violence on the slave ships, slave rebellions happening and people being killed. And it's important to note that 4 million enslaved Africans were sent to Brazil alone. So the transatlantic slave trade is often described as a triangular system, meaning that in the first step, ships left Western Europe for Africa loaded with merchandise that was to be exchanged for enslaved African human beings. Iron, liquor, weapons, gunpowder, textiles, and other manufactured goods. And in Africa, the captains would trade their merchandise for captives over a period of weeks or months. These were very often individuals who had been marched from the interior to coastal slave fortresses where they were waiting for a very long time sometimes to get onto these ships and to go to a place that they couldn't imagine and had no idea where they were going, where they wouldn't know the language, where they wouldn't know the terrain, where they could be held in captivity for the rest of their lives and basically worked to death. In the second step, Africans were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas to be sold. And because it was the second of 3 stages, this phase was known as the Middle Passage. It was a harrowing journey, even under the best of circumstances. The conditions were brutal, the death toll was high. Those of us who investigate that period of history see sort of the elaborate considerations and discussions that were going on around how many enslaved people can you pack into a ship? Do they need to come up and get oxygen and light on the deck every now and then? Do they need to exercise? What's the minimum that you can feed them over this period of time and still have them as a saleable good at the end of the journey? I mean, when we consider the conditions in which these ancestors made their way across the Atlantic, there is no way not to feel grief, sorrow, and horror. But it is remarkable that so many of them did survive, and many of us are here as a result because of their resilience and their strength. So I've discussed the first 2 stages, the goods being brought to Africa, the Africans being loaded onto ships. In the third step, once the captives from Africa had been distributed at slave markets in North, South, or Central America or the Caribbean, the slave traders would return to Europe, bringing back products that the enslaved Africans had produced. Things like sugar, cotton, coffee, cocoa, tobacco, rice, goods that had been produced by enslaved Africans. Sometimes it was precious metals that they had been involved in mining. Here in Canada, enslaved Africans and Indigenous people were responsible for other goods too, such as lumber, timber, and the fur trade. So fine furs produced by enslaved Africans would make their way back to Europe. Here in Windsor, where we're sitting now, most of us, many of the enslaved Africans that worked for local so-called founding families, such as the Bobbies and the Duffs, were involved in the slave trade, something that's not widely known. The European countries that were most involved in the transatlantic slave trade were Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Great Britain, and France, although they weren't the only ones. And their economies benefited greatly from the trade, as did the economies of the colonies that they formed in the Americas and the independent nations that those colonies would eventually become. Who did not benefit from the trade, of course, were the people of African descent who were doing the bulk of the work. And those economic disparities continue to persist in many of these countries today, which is why we're coming towards the end of the United Nations International Decade for Persons of African Descent, which is a whole program that is continuing to look into the impact of the transatlantic slave trade on people of African descent throughout the world and what needs to be done to right those wrongs, address the history, and correct those disparities. So it's important to note that for sure, when we look at the history of countries in the Western Hemisphere, we have to understand that the hidden history, some places it's not so hidden, but the hidden history is that much of this wealth was built on the backs of people of African descent and the original Africans who came. And there is a lack of understanding sometimes of the impact that the transatlantic slave trade had on the continent of Africa as well, and the loss of all of those, great individuals, their capabilities, their skills, their ability to protect their villages and their homes, their ability to maintain family bonds and maintain their culture. Those are things that can never be rebuilt or replicated. We have to have an understanding, though, of the damage that the transatlantic slave trade has done to all of us African peoples all around the world, and an understanding of the fact that there is a need to address those disparities and find a workable, sustainable system of righting those wrongs. So that, in a nutshell, is the story of how people of African descent ended up in the Western Hemisphere. And I would encourage you, as you're walking around Canada, Ontario, Essex County, if you're here where I am watching this, as you're going about your business, consider the roles that people of African descent who were enslaved here on Canadian soil played in establishing these communities from which people are now benefiting, clearing the land, tilling the soil, becoming, among the first people to actually farm this land, working in the fur trade, working in all of the businesses that enriched their slave masters, and basically living their entire lives as property, listed in wills as inventory, willed from person to person, sold and bought, treated like the furniture. We have to be mindful of those things in addressing our Canadian history as well. Thank you for your attention, and do take care.